Sejam bem-vindos ao estúdio AgriNews Play. Nós estamos aqui no espaço do 4º Fórum Brasil Sul de Bovinos de Corte e o Simpósio Brasil Sul de Bovinos de Leite também. Nós tivemos uma palestra importante do Dr. Brad Gilchrist, gerente global da cadeia de carne bovina na Cemex. Ele falou sobre Beef on Dairy no Brasil, quando faz sentido adotar. O Sérgio Abreu nos acompanha, Sérgio Abreu Machado, supervisor técnico de bovinocultura de corte na Cooperalfa, foi mediador da palestra, vai me ajudar aqui no bate-papo com o professor. Sérgio, se você me permite, já vou partir para a primeira pergunta. At the country level, what needs to be in place in Brazil for beef on dairy to work? For example, buyers, logistics for calves, links with dairies, and health welfare rules.
Thanks for the question, and certainly thanks for the invite to be here on the podcast today. One of the biggest things in any country when we start to implement beef on dairy is the rearing of the calves. And so that's taking the calves from day one right through to about 200 kilos. Once we get the calves to 200 kilos, there's typically lots of options to feed those cattle, whether we're going to feed them in a pasture-based environment or in some sort of a feed yard. But the biggest bottleneck right now is going to be rearing those calves from day one right through till they're approximately 200 kilos.
For a single farm, what are the minimum herd and reproduction conditions to consider beef on dairy without hurting heifer replacement?
Yeah, so there's a number of different factors that we need to look at when we're deciding whether we should implement a beef on dairy strategy and to what extent that beef on dairy strategy should be. So at the very basic level, a dairy needs to make sure they're utilizing sexed semen to create the right replacement females. We definitely want to make sure that every dairy that uses beef on dairy, first and foremost, is creating enough replacement females to maintain their milking herd. And so then once they're using sexed semen, and it's best if they can utilize a genomic test to identify which of those females should get used with sexed semen. Once they have a really good strategy in place for creating those females out of the very best females in their herds, then we can use the rest of the herd for beef on dairy. Now, the volume of beef on dairy really depends on their success rate with sexed semen. And so if we can get a high conception rate and out of a really well-managed herd, then we can push the number of beef calves coming out of that herd up in towards the 50% of the entire herd. So out of every 100 cows, we would be able to create 50 beef calves. Now that's out of an exceptionally well-managed herd. I would suggest that most people probably aim for around 1/3 of their herd is producing beef calves, and while 2/3 are creating dairy replacement females.
In hot climates and with zebu blood in the dairy herd, which bull types breeders work best? Which ones would you avoid in this context, and why?
Yeah, so the zebu challenge, I guess I'm going to say, with raising beef is certainly one that we see on both the native beef cows as well as beef on dairy. And, the same as in native beef cattle, it's going to be the same challenges on the beef on dairy. And so we want to protect the amount of back fat that we create on these cattle. So again, depending on the management of how they're being fed, if they're being fed a really high energy diet, a high starch diet, then we want to make sure that we limit the amount of back fat that can get put on those cattle through the genetic selection. If, though, these cattle are going into a grass-fed system where the energy requirements or the energy that's available to these calves is low, then we probably need to focus on putting more back fat onto those cattle to be able to protect the carcass once it's hanging. All of these things are things that we can look at with genetics and really select for a specific type of animal that we need to then feed and move on to the processor.
Sérgio, se você quiser cruzar a conversa,
Oh,
fica à vontade.
okay.
Tá tranquilo?
Obrigado.
What do buyers, packers usually require for these crossbreds? How can farms secure this in advance, for example, with agreements or letters of intent?
Yeah, so every processor around the world has a different buyer, and whether they're selling into a high quality market that demands premium marbling, or into a more yield based market where they just want lean meat yield, it requires a totally different animal. And to me, the really exciting part that we have the opportunity to be a part of with the genetics is we can help create both types of animals depending on the animal that they're trying to create. And so really for us, it's more about having a conversation with the processor, understanding what their needs and their wants are for the type of product that they need to create. And then we can work backwards in creating the product right from the very beginning, put them on the proper management system to be able to create the animals that ultimately will create the product that we want to hit for our specs.
For selling the calves, crossbreds, which models are working in Brazil? What should a farm check in this region to ensure liquidity?
Yeah, so great question. Again, it's all about creating something that's in demand. And so if we want to create a product that is highly demanded, we need to know what that buyer is looking for. And so if we're a dairy and we're selling those calves to a calf raiser, then we need to understand what that calf raiser wants. And that calf raiser, for the most part, wants good, strong, healthy calves that transition from the dairy onto their feeding program with limited problems, and then they gain weight extremely well once they're on their management system. And then if you're a calf raiser and you're selling those calves to the processor, then again, we want to understand what that processor needs and wants are in creating the right type of carcass for them. And if we're the processor, then we need to understand what the consumers want and where we're selling those calves in the future. And so to me, it's really understanding what the buyer's needs and wants are, no matter who the buyer is in the supply chain, and then creating an animal that aligns with the management practice to fit those needs.
A vaca começou a mugir de novo,
Okay.
Tá chamando o pessoal para palestra aqui,
Oh, that's
Sérgio.
okay.
Sérgio, você como uma pessoa que atua diretamente no setor, como que você vê a palestra do professor, do Dr. Brad aqui para o público e já parabenizando pelo crescimento do público, fortalecimento do Fórum Brasil Sul de Bovinos de Corte?
Bom, nessa manhã a gente teve uma grata surpresa de receber mais de 700 pessoas no auditório lá. Então a gente está bem contente com isso. Isso demonstra o crescimento não só da atividade, mas o reconhecimento do trabalho do núcleo Vet perante o pessoal que é engajado na cadeia de corte, né? E de leite também. A palestra do Brad hoje foi excelente, porque ela traz uma interface bastante importante entre o corte e o leite. Então, são dois assuntos que tratam tanto o fórum como o simpósio unidos em uma palestra. E é uma tendência para o Brasil, muito embora a gente precise aprender muito mais sobre o que o Brad falou hoje, mas a gente está num caminho. E na sequência eu acho que eu vou fazer uma também pergunta nesse sentido para o Brad, para ver o que ele acha.
Por favor, pode emendar.
Okay, Brad. Seems to be that the beef and dairy is a trend, a global trend, and especially in countries that have large dairy herds. How do you see this evolving? So we've been using various high-tech tools like genomic readings, and this is very accessible. It's easy to use, actually. How do you see this in terms of how do you see this globally going in, say, next 5 or 10 years?
Yeah, I think it's all about the data.
Yeah.
And to me, when I look at the traditional way of purchasing beef cattle has been visual appraisal. So producers would go to an auction yard or privately to a producer, and they would visually look at a pen of cattle and they'd say, yep, those cattle look good, and I think that we should be able to put them on feed and do X, Y, and Z. I think that the day is coming where we're going to see that change. And while visual appraisal is still very important to, analyze structure and integrity and muscle shape, I also think that the data behind those cattle is equally or more important. And understanding what the potential for a group of animals are in terms of what their genetic potential is, I think is critical. And so once we know which animals have the genetic potential to perform, then we can align that potential with the management style and ultimately create the product that we need. And so we're a few years away, I think, from seeing that come into practice. But I do think that some of the very advanced markets on the beef and dairy space are seeing that the cattle that have the right genetics in them perform at a significantly different pace than the cattle that have poor genetics. And so there is a huge monetary difference between the best and the worst.
It seems to be a consumer-driven market. They'll dictate what kind of product they want to consume, right?
Yeah, 100%.
As far as Brazil is concerned, what would you think we could do to expedite the process of starting more beef and dairy?
I think Brazil's sitting in a really good spot, to be honest. I think, the cost of production here in Brazil is quite reasonable. There's a huge land mass here, and there's an appetite to feed really good cattle. Brazil for decades has done a phenomenal job of raising beef cattle. So the idea of raising calves is not new to Brazil. And I think, the really good thing about it too is we can learn from other people's mistakes. And so
absolutely.
When I look at North America and I see what they did in the early days of beef on dairy and using some of those genetics that maybe didn't perform as good as they needed to in the feed yard, I think here in Brazil, we can skip a number of steps and making sure that we don't put those poor genetics into a herd to then have somebody feed them out. I think we can skip right through to what we've learned, and that the data will allow us to make the right advancements in the early days.
Yeah, we're able to take some shortcuts.
Absolutely.
That's good. That's good.
Muito obrigada, Sérgio. Tá feito? Thank you, Dr. Brad. Nice to meet you. Obrigada, Sérgio. Obrigada a você que nos acompanha. E não esquece de se inscrever no canal para continuar acompanhando as melhores notícias do setor.